Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp. This is my third video in my three-part series on angels and demons. Just what are they in the context of Western ceremonial magic? I'm going to talk more about whether the phenomenon of angels and demons is something that is just happening in our head when we interact with these beings, or whether they have some external objective reality. So let's get straight into it. So in Western ceremonial magic, there are certain workings or procedures which will allow you to call upon and interact with two types of beings, angels on the one hand and demons on the other. And you will interact with either an angel or a demon depending on what you're hoping to achieve. The medieval magicians invoked angels in order to gain higher knowledge. Sometimes they could be called upon for healing or self-actualization, but often with selfless intent. Whereas demons would be called upon to get things in the material world, things that the magician desired in the world, and also for cursing people. It's very much appealing to what is typically called our lower nature. So you do a ritual and an angel or a demon appears. You have some experience of that type of entity. Just what is it that is behind that experience? Is it just something that your brain is doing? Or is it some kind of being that has come into the room with you? The occult community is divided on this issue. There are the, let's call them theists, who believe that all of the myths were true and that these beings really exist as people that inhabit a different plane of existence. And when you have an experience of them, you're having an experience of a being from another dimension. The other camp says that no, these forces are just archetypes, and when we have an experience of them, we're just having an experience of our own consciousness or a different aspect of our consciousness. And the reason you're having the experience is because one part of your psychology is communicating with another part. So what do I think the right answer is here? Well, I certainly don't agree with the idea that the ancient myths of the past were literally true, and that gods and devils and elementals and all of those kinds of beings walked around in exactly the way that they're described in the ancient books of the past and the ancient stories. I think that is quite far-fetched. I don't believe that God exists in that fashion, and I've criticized the idea of God existing in that way in previous videos, nor do I think that any of the other entities inhabiting other planes of existence in other religions exist in that fashion. So then, what, do I agree with the psychological explanation for angels and demons? Well, I think there are very persuasive elements of that view of angels and demons. If you look at the way that human consciousness or the human psychology is structured and separated, it's very much in keeping with the way that the spiritual planes of existence are structured. I've discussed that in my previous video. So the map of the spiritual cosmos, the planes of existence, does seem to be a map of our own psychology. And we can easily explain why we would experience a part of ourselves as another being, because when you really start to observe the human mind, when you start to observe the human psyche, you realize that we are not as individuated nor as self-aware as is often assumed. We have no static sense of self. We have different parts of us, whether that's different drives or ambitions or values, that are constantly competing with each other and contradicting each other. So our consciousness is really legion. We have a legion of impressions, of personalities, of drives inhabiting the same body. Some of those we are conscious of, aware of, others we are not conscious of. And typically, because we like to think of ourselves as a civilized people, we tend to repress those parts of us which are more primitive and animalistic in nature, which don't reflect kindly on us, irrespective of whether they are a genuine part of us. These are the parts that are typically described as demonic. And that may or may not be a wise decision. Although there's a lot of value judgments in the labels of angelic and demonic, I'm trying to separate that as much as I can from these presentations. But that is undoubtedly something that comes into play with this, in the way that we see these things. So if we have parts of us that represent a different drive, and we're unaware of that part of ourselves, or we refuse to acknowledge that part of ourselves, then the only way that our mind could process that part of us communicating with the conscious mind is if it conceptualized that other part of us as another person, another entity. And this is where the angelic and the demonic come into it. And we would categorize those beings according to where they sit in our moral universe. Are they better than we suppose we are? Are they worse than we suppose we are? And then accordingly, we would class them as either an angel or a demon. Well, that sounds pretty feasible. So do we draw a line in the sand and say, that's it? Angels and demons are all in your head. Well, I don't think it's quite as simple as that. For one thing, if you've had experience with magic, which often involves interacting with these beings in one form or another, you start to realize that the agency that these entities are exerting is not something that is just changing your own brain, changing your own psyche. It can actually have an effect on the outside world quite independent of what's going on in your head. So that suggests an external influence. Now, that's not to say that these things are separate from us, because it could still be us exerting that external influence, but with a different part of our psyche, one that we're not as aware of. And that's not even to say that these forces or influences that exert themselves on the external world are even conscious. If there were external angels or demons, we couldn't really comment on their level of consciousness, because consciousness is so subjective that the only being that knows whether a particular being has a particular level of consciousness is that being themselves. But you can have forces or energies or entities that are capable of influencing the world which aren't conscious. Think about a very advanced machine, such as a robot, or think of a corporation. A corporation is an entity, and it is a legal person, but it's not alive. But nevertheless, a corporation can have a great influence on the external world, and there have been many corporations in history that have behaved just like a dark entity from the abyss in terms of seducing its followers and working through them to bring destruction to the planet. So those questions are quite separate from the question of the externality of angels and demons. But a more persuasive argument for why angelic or demonic entities have some external existence has to do with looking past the assumptions that we make about ourselves. In the same way as we think that we are a single individuated entity with a singular fixed identity, and we think that we are in control of our own impulses, we also believe that we are separate from the universe that we inhabit, and that is simply not the case. All of these different impulses that we have, all of these different drives that we have, they are in a sense, a continuation or a repetition of an influence in the external world, a force in the external world. And everything that makes up the different parts of us is also a part of some kind of force or principle in the world. You think about our physical being. We have blood running through our veins. In the same way, there's rivers that run through the world, the veins of the earth. And so the water that is in the veins of the earth is in many respects the same as the water that runs through our veins, the liquid that runs through our veins. They are just different manifestations of the same phenomenon. Similarly, the air we breathe is air that comes from the atmosphere of the surrounding planet. Those two things are not separate. The breath of our mouth is the same as the wind that develops into a hurricane. And just as our physical being can be seen as a continuation of the phenomena of nature, so too can the archetypes that inhabit our psyche, that are embodied in different ways in our psyche, or personified in different ways in our psyche, can be seen as a manifestation of some abstract principle that is involved in shaping the external universe. To illustrate what I mean a bit more clearly, I'll use the example of the Hermetic view of the 7 planets. So in Hermeticism, the universe is divided into the realms of the 7 planets, and each of the 7 classical planets is said to exert a different influence over the physical world, represented by the Earth. Now, what this is talking about is not the literal planets sending some sort of ray of energy to human beings on the Earth that pick up on it like a radio and act accordingly. No, what it's talking about is those planets are simply a representation of a more abstract principle. And there are several such principles that operate in different ways and together comprise the governing principles of the universe. So to use an example, the planet Saturn represents death, decay, separation, limitation, and darkness. So with the principle of Saturn, if you were to explain what that looks like in terms of influences on the external universe, it's the law of entropy. It's the impulse for matter to solidify into things that are separate from the absolute and which are in a form that is restricted and determined and doesn't contain as much potentiality in it anymore because it's crystallized into that physical form. And by separating everything, by sundering the absolute into these individual physical things, you're also creating a series of physical objects which are limited in nature and have a beginning and an end. Hence the association of the principle of Saturn with death. And so that's a very clear principle that we can see operating in the universe around us. But we can similarly see that same principle operating as a psychological phenomenon. When people feel melancholy or they feel depressed, it's a very Saturnian kind of an energy. It's a sense of separation from other people, separation from the world, and a kind of darkness that comes over us as a result of that. When people engage in murder, that's a Saturnian drive because you're bringing death to other people. When we have morbid thoughts about death and destruction, this is very much a Saturnian impulse. And Saturn is a good example because Saturn in traditional astrology is considered the great malefic and a force of spiritual darkness, which is keeping us imprisoned in a limited physical existence, and which represents all of the challenges that we face as a result of that limitation. So it's very closely associated with the demonic world, with the way that demonic forces are said to influence the human race. And of course, Saturn was one of the old gods of chaos that the Olympians had to defeat when they became the new governing forces of the cosmos. And so when we encounter an angel or a demon, it is our consciousness trying to make sense of something that it doesn't recognize, which is a kind of force in its own right, an entity or an energy in its own right, which overlaps at various points, both with the external forces of nature and with our internal psychological states. And we can never know what level of consciousness it has, and to what extent it is independent of our own consciousness, rather than simply piggybacking off our own consciousness and working through us. But we can see these beings in terms of different principles. So that's what I've got to say about angels and demons. I don't know if that brings us any closer to understanding them or not, but maybe it's given you some food for thought. So leave your comments down below. Any opinion that you have on this idea, I'd love to hear about it. If you've enjoyed these videos, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.